"Call an Uber, Dad. I've got something going on tonight." My son Connor said that to me at 11:40 at night over the phone, his voice carrying a specific, distracted flatness that told me, even before I'd fully processed the words, that whatever something going on meant, it clearly mattered more to him in that moment than his own grandfather's blood sugar crashing in the next room. My name is Frank Delacroix. I'm 58 years old. I run a small HVAC and plumbing supply business outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And for the past 3 years, my father Walter, 79, has lived with me since my mother passed, and his type 1 diabetes had progressed to the point where living alone had become too risky for anyone in our family to feel comfortable with. My mother, Ellen Delacroix, passed 4 years ago after a long illness of her own, and I remember the specific, difficult months that followed, watching my father, who'd been married to her for 51 years, try to manage both his grief and an increasingly complicated diabetes regimen entirely on his own in the house they'd shared for decades. I moved him into my own home about a year after she passed, once it became clear, through 2 separate incidents involving dangerously low blood sugar that neighbors had to intervene in, that his living alone had become a genuine safety concern, rather than simply a matter of independence he was entitled to insist on. The adjustment, for both of us, took considerably longer than either of us initially expected. My father had been a fiercely independent man his entire life, working 38 years as a supervisor at a chemical plant along the river, and I understood, watching him settle into my guest room, exactly how much it cost him, in terms of pride, to accept that he needed the kind of daily oversight I was now providing. We developed over that first year a careful, workable rhythm. His insulin schedule mapped onto our shared calendar, regular check-ins that never quite crossed into the kind of hovering he'd made clear, early on, he wouldn't tolerate. A balance I worked hard to maintain even as his condition, over the following years, became increasingly unpredictable in ways that made that balance harder to sustain. That Tuesday night in March started like most difficult nights with my father's condition eventually start. An ordinary evening that turned, within the space of about 20 minutes, into a genuine emergency. My father's blood sugar reading falling to numbers that our endocrinologist had specifically told us required immediate action. At the exact same moment, I discovered his last insulin pen had malfunctioned, and our backup supply, which should have been in the refrigerator. I want to describe the specific, escalating panic of that discovery. Standing in my own kitchen at 11:30 at night, my father sweating and disoriented in his recliner in the next room, understanding that I needed to get him either emergency insulin or to an emergency room within the next several minutes, and discovering, in that same moment, that my own truck had been sitting in Thibodeaux's auto repair since that morning with a transmission problem that wasn't going to be fixed until Thursday. I had no working vehicle in my driveway, a father in genuine medical crisis, and a phone in my hand that I just used to call the one person I assumed, without any real hesitation, would drop everything to help. I remember the specific, disorienting sequence of that half hour with a clarity I don't have for most ordinary evenings, checking my father's blood sugar reading twice, unable to fully believe the first number, searching the refrigerator door shelf where his backup insulin pen should have been, finding only an empty box that told me, with a sinking realization, that we'd used the last one the previous week without either of us remembering to reorder in time. My father, watching me search with increasing urgency, tried to reassure me between his own visible disorientation that he'd be fine, that we could wait until morning for the pharmacy to open, a suggestion I understood, even through my own rising panic, was itself a warning sign, given how uncharacteristically dismissive he was being about his own safety. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Now let's get back to it. Connor is 26 years old, my only child, and lives about 15 minutes from me in an apartment near the industrial park where he works as a shift supervisor at a logistics warehouse. I want to be honest that our relationship, in the years since his own divorce 2 years earlier, had grown considerably more distant than I was fully willing to admit to myself before that Tuesday night. A distance built from a specific combination of his own difficult stretch following the divorce and my own tendency, I've come to understand, to avoid pressing him too hard about it. Telling myself he needed space to work through his own difficulties, rather than acknowledging how much that space had actually cost our relationship. Connor's marriage to his college girlfriend Melissa had lasted just under 3 years before ending. A divorce that, from what he'd shared with me at the time, had been driven largely by Melissa's decision to pursue a graduate program in another state, a decision Connor had struggled to fully accept even as he tried to be supportive of it. I remember the specific version of Connor that emerged in the months following that divorce, considerably quieter than the son I'd known growing up, declining most invitations to family dinners, giving vague, deflecting answers whenever I asked how he was actually doing, a pattern I attributed at the time to ordinary post-divorce grief that would resolve on its own with enough time and space. Looking back, I understand now how much I missed during those 2 years, how easily I let Connor's specific brand of withdrawal read as simple sadness, rather than a warning sign of something considerably more serious developing underneath it. I'd call him every week or two, and our conversations over that stretch grew increasingly brief and surface level. Both of us, I think, complicit in a specific, unspoken agreement to keep things light rather than risk uncovering something neither of us was fully prepared to address directly. I called Connor first, before anyone else, because he was the closest person I could think of with a working vehicle, and because some part of me, I think, simply assumed that a family medical emergency involving his own grandfather would override whatever else he had going on that particular Tuesday night. His response, "Call an Uber, Dad, I've got something going on tonight," delivered in a voice that had none of the urgency the situation clearly called for, landed with a specific, disorienting shock that I didn't have time to fully process in the moment. My father's condition too urgent to spend precious minutes arguing with my own son about his priorities. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think, and we're nowhere near the end of this one. I hung up on Connor without a response, understanding I didn't have the luxury of time to process what had just happened, and I called the only other person I could think of who might genuinely be able to help within the next several critical minutes. My neighbor Warren Boudreau, a retired paramedic who'd lived 2 houses down for the better part of a decade, a man I knew well enough to wave to most mornings, but who I'd never once had occasion to call in an actual emergency. Warren answered on the second ring, and I remember the specific, immediate shift in his voice once I explained what was happening, the calm, practiced urgency of a man who'd spent 30 years responding to exactly this kind of crisis, telling me he'd be in my driveway within 3 minutes. I knew Warren before that night, largely the way you know a longtime neighbor whose life runs parallel to your own, without ever quite intersecting it directly. The occasional wave from the driveway, a brief conversation about lawn care or hurricane preparations, the specific, comfortable familiarity of someone you'd recognize instantly, but couldn't have told you much about beyond the broad strokes. I knew he'd worked as a paramedic for over 3 decades before retiring 5 years earlier. Knew he'd lost his own wife to cancer around the same time my mother passed. A shared grief that had never actually come up between us directly, despite how much, I would later realize, it probably would have given us to talk about if either of us had ever found the occasion. Warren was in my driveway in closer to 90 seconds, still in the t-shirt and sweatpants he'd clearly been wearing when I called. And I want to describe what it felt like, watching a 71-year-old retired paramedic move through my house with the specific, unhurried competence of a man who'd done exactly this kind of assessment thousands of times over his career. Checking my father's pulse and responsiveness with a calm that did more to steady my own panic than almost anything else could have in that moment. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. He needs the ER, Frank, not just insulin, Warren told me, already helping my father into a standing position with the specific, careful technique of decades of professional practice. His blood sugar's low enough and he's disoriented enough that I want medical staff looking at him directly, not just a shot of insulin and hoping for the best. Get your keys, or actually, don't worry about your keys. We're taking my truck. I'll drive. We got my father to Our Lady of the Lakes emergency room in 11 minutes, Warren driving with a specific, controlled urgency that told me, watching him, exactly how many times over his career he'd made a similar drive under similar circumstances. The ER staff, once we arrived, moved my father back for treatment within minutes of our arrival, Warren staying with me in the waiting room for the better part of 2 hours, providing a specific, steady presence I don't think I fully appreciated in the moment, too consumed with worry about my father to register how remarkable it was that a neighbor I barely knew had dropped everything, at midnight, for a family that wasn't technically his own. I remember sitting in that waiting room, unable to focus on anything, Warren beside me talking quietly, filling the silence with a specific, practiced calm that I understood, even in my own distracted state, was itself a kind of skill honed over decades of sitting with frightened family members during exactly this kind of wait. He told me, at one point, about his late wife Colette, about the specific parallel he saw between watching me worry over my father and his own years of watching her decline. A story I hadn't expected, but that somehow made the waiting more bearable, the shared vulnerability of it creating a specific closeness between two men who'd been little more than friendly neighbors 12 hours earlier. Around 1 in the morning, a nurse came out to update us, explaining that my father's blood sugar had stabilized and that they wanted to keep him for observation for a few more hours before releasing him. A piece of news that let some of the tension finally drain out of my shoulders for the first time since I discovered his empty insulin supply. Warren insisted on staying the full 2 hours until my father was cleared, waving off my repeated suggestions that he should head home and get some rest, telling me, simply, that he wasn't going anywhere until he saw my father walk out of that hospital himself. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. My father was stabilized by 2 in the morning, his blood sugar back within a safe range. The ER physician explaining that we'd caught the crisis with enough time to prevent what could have become a considerably more serious outcome, a diabetic emergency that, left untreated even another 20 or 30 minutes, could have progressed into something with genuinely life-threatening consequences. The physician, a woman named Dr. Aisha Bello, who'd been on duty that night, took a few extra minutes to walk me through the specific timeline that had made the difference, explaining that at the reading my father's blood sugar had reached by the time we arrived, the margin between stabilization and a considerably more dangerous outcome had genuinely been measured in minutes rather than hours. She told me, with a specific, direct gravity I appreciated even through my own exhaustion, that Warren's quick response and correct initial assessment had likely been just as important as the ER treatment itself, that a slower or less informed response could have meaningfully changed the outcome we were fortunate enough to be discussing instead. I want to describe the specific, overwhelming relief of hearing that assessment, sitting in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning next to a neighbor who'd essentially saved my father's life through nothing more than answering his phone quickly and knowing exactly what to do once he arrived. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. Connor called me the following morning around 10, his voice carrying none of the previous night's distracted flatness, asking how his grandfather was doing, a question that landed, I want to be honest, with a specific, complicated anger I hadn't fully processed yet from the night before. I told him plainly that Warren Boudreaux had driven us to the ER at midnight because Connor himself had been too busy to help, and I listened to a long silence on the other end of the phone before Connor finally asked, in a considerably smaller voice than I'd heard from him in years, what exactly had happened that I hadn't already told him. I gave him the full account that morning, standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, describing the blood sugar reading, the missing insulin supply, the 11-minute drive to the ER with a neighbor because his own son hadn't been available, and the 2 hours in the waiting room not knowing whether my father's condition would stabilize before something worse happened. I remember Connor's voice through that entire recounting, quieter and more careful than I'd heard from him in a long time, offering no excuses, no defense, just a kind of stunned, absorbed silence punctuated by occasional, small acknowledgments that he was still listening. "Is Grandpa okay?" he finally asked when I'd finished. "He's okay," I told him. "No thanks to you." I want to be honest that I regretted that particular sentence almost as soon as I said it, not because it wasn't true, but because I could hear, even through the phone, exactly how much it landed, Connor going quiet again for a long moment before telling me, in a voice thick with something I couldn't quite identify yet, that he needed to come talk to me in person, that there was more to the previous night than what he'd been able to explain over the phone the night before. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. I want to be honest that I did not handle that phone call particularly well. My own exhaustion and lingering fear from the preceding night making it considerably harder than it should have been to have a calm, constructive conversation with my son about what had happened. I told him, with more anger in my voice than I'm proud of in retrospect, that his grandfather could have died while he was too busy with whatever had mattered more than a family emergency. And I listened to Connor's voice crack, on the other end of the line, in a way that told me, even through my own anger, that something more complicated than simple indifference was sitting underneath his refusal the night before. It took nearly a week, following that difficult phone call, before Connor and I finally sat down together, at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd stood in panic 3 days earlier discovering my father's missing insulin supply, for a conversation that Connor initiated himself, driving over unannounced on a Sunday afternoon with a specific, visible nervousness that told me he'd been building up to it for days. I remember watching him pull into my driveway that Sunday, sitting in his car for what looked like nearly a full minute before finally coming inside, and I understood, watching that hesitation through my kitchen window, that whatever he'd come to tell me had cost him considerable effort to work up to. My father was napping in the back bedroom when Connor arrived, which felt, in retrospect, like its own small mercy, giving Connor and me the private space to have the conversation neither of us had quite managed over the phone. Connor sat down across from me without much preamble, his hands wrapped around a glass of water he didn't drink from, and I watched him work up to whatever he'd come to say through several false starts, clearing his throat, looking down at the table before he finally found the words. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. I need to tell you what actually happened that night, Connor told me, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table. I wasn't just busy with something unimportant, Dad. I've been in a lot of financial trouble since the divorce, more than I've told you. I owe money to some people I shouldn't have gotten involved with in the first place, gambling debt, and that Tuesday night, I was meeting with one of them to try to work out a payment plan before things got considerably worse than they already were. I panicked when you called, because I was already panicking about the meeting, and I said something terrible instead of just telling you the truth. I've felt sick about it every single day since. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting across that table hearing my son finally explain the fuller context of that Tuesday night, understanding, with a specific, complicated mixture of relief and renewed worry, that his refusal hadn't been simple selfishness, but a symptom of a considerably larger crisis he'd been carrying alone, ashamed to tell either of his parents, for months before that night finally forced the issue into the open. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Connor told me that afternoon about the full scope of what he'd been carrying, nearly $18,000 in gambling debt accumulated over the 18 months following his divorce, a period he described, with visible shame, as one where he'd turned to online poker and sports betting, as a way of managing a specific, overwhelming loneliness he hadn't known how to process any other way, the debt compounding steadily as he tried, unsuccessfully, to gamble his way back out of increasingly desperate financial holes, rather than admitting the problem to anyone who might have actually helped him address it. He described the specific progression to me in more detail than I expected him to be willing to share, starting with occasional, low-stakes online poker games he'd played with a few coworkers during his loneliest weeks right after Melissa moved out, a habit that had felt, at the time, like nothing more than a harmless way to fill empty evenings that had once been shared with someone else. He told me how that habit had gradually escalated over the following year, the stakes climbing as his losses accumulated, each losing session creating a specific, desperate hope that the next one might finally recoup what he'd already lost. A pattern he said he understood, intellectually, was a well-documented trap even as he'd found himself unable to step back from it in the moment. The specific people he owed money to, he told me, weren't a formal casino or betting operation, but a private, informal poker circuit that had, over the preceding 6 months, become increasingly aggressive about collecting what he owed, a detail that had genuinely frightened him enough to keep him awake most nights in the weeks leading up to that Tuesday. That particular meeting, the one he'd been rushing to when I called about my father, had been his attempt to negotiate an extended payment timeline with the two men most aggressively demanding repayment, a meeting he described as tense enough that he'd genuinely been unable to think clearly about anything else in the moment I'd called, If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to be honest that learning this didn't erase the anger I still carried about that Tuesday night, about a decision that had genuinely put my father at risk regardless of whatever crisis Connor himself had been managing simultaneously. But it did reshape, considerably, how I understood the shape of what had actually happened, moving the story from a simple account of a son too selfish to help his own grandfather into something considerably more complicated. A young man in genuine, serious trouble, too ashamed to ask for help, whose own crisis had collided at the worst possible moment with his family's emergency. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. We spent that Sunday afternoon working through the fuller shape of Connor's financial situation, and I want to describe the specific, difficult calculus of deciding how to actually help him, understanding that simply paying off his debt outright risked reinforcing exactly the pattern that had gotten him into trouble in the first place, while leaving him to manage it entirely alone had already, demonstrably, produced a Tuesday night that could have cost my father his life. I remember sitting with that specific tension for several days after our kitchen conversation, turning over different approaches in my head, worried, on one hand, about the immediate physical safety concerns Connor had described regarding the men he owed money to, and equally worried, on the other, about becoming an enabler who simply erased the consequences of a pattern that needed genuine, sustained intervention rather than a one-time financial rescue. I talked through the situation with my own father, once he'd recovered enough to have the conversation, curious what his perspective might be as someone who'd spent 38 years managing a household budget with the kind of careful discipline that had let him retire comfortably. He told me something that stuck with me through the following weeks, that the goal wasn't to protect Connor from ever facing hard consequences again, but to make sure the consequences he faced going forward were the kind that actually taught him something, rather than the kind that could get him seriously hurt. I called my own financial advisor the following week, a woman named Patricia Ackhaffer who'd helped manage my business finances for over a decade, and asked her to meet with Connor directly, to help him build an actual structured plan for addressing the debt himself, with my financial backing as a bridge loan rather than an outright gift, contingent on Connor also agreeing to see a gambling addiction counselor. Patricia met with Connor twice over the following month, helping him build a detailed repayment structure that used a loan from me to immediately satisfy the most urgent, physically threatening portion of his debt, paired with a strict monthly repayment schedule back to me that Connor, notably, insisted on making more aggressive than Patricia herself initially suggested, telling her he needed the pressure of a tight timeline to actually hold himself accountable. Patricia told me, after that first meeting, that she'd been genuinely impressed with how seriously Connor approached the process, bringing his own bank statements and a rough budget he'd already started sketching out before their meeting, a level of proactive engagement, she said, she didn't always see from clients in similarly difficult financial situations. She helped him set up automatic transfers that pulled a fixed amount from his paycheck the day it arrived, before he had any opportunity to spend it elsewhere, a specific structural safeguard Connor told me later he'd asked for himself, understanding that his own willpower alone hadn't been sufficient to prevent the situation from developing in the first place, and wasn't something he wanted to rely on exclusively going forward either. I also told Connor's mother, my ex-wife Denise, about the full situation during that same stretch, a conversation I'd been dreading almost as much as the original one with Connor himself, given how protective she'd always been of him growing up. Denise and I had divorced amicably when Connor was 16, and we'd maintained a genuinely cooperative co-parenting relationship in the years since. But I still worried, calling her that week, about how she'd receive news of just how much trouble Connor had gotten himself into without either of us noticing. Her reaction, when I finally explained everything, surprised me, less anger than a specific, focused determination to help however she could, offering to cover part of the counseling costs Connor's insurance didn't fully address, and insisting on a regular phone check-in with him herself, separate from my own involvement, wanting him to know he had more than one parent actively invested in his recovery. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going. And we've got a lot more coming in this one. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe because what happens next is the part I still think about most. Connor agreed to both conditions without any real resistance, a specific, visible relief crossing his face when I laid out the plan, telling me later that some part of him had actually been hoping, for months, that someone would force the issue into the open before it got any worse than it already had, that he'd simply never found the courage to bring it up himself. He started seeing a counselor named Dr. Marcus Reyes twice a month, beginning about 3 weeks after that Sunday conversation, working through not just the immediate gambling behavior, but the underlying loneliness and shame that Dr. Reyes helped him understand had been driving it since the earliest weeks following his divorce. I want to be honest that the road since then has not been perfectly smooth. There was a difficult stretch, about 4 months in, when Connor relapsed briefly, placing a small bet during a particularly stressful week at work, a lapse he told me about himself, unprompted within 24 hours, understanding correctly that hiding it again would only recreate the exact pattern that had almost cost his grandfather's life. I remember that phone call vividly, Connor's voice tight with a specific, anticipatory dread as he told me what he'd done, clearly braced for the same anger I'd shown him the morning after that Tuesday night. I want to describe what it felt like, hearing him confess something considerably smaller than the original crisis, but that carried, for both of us, an outsized weight given everything we'd already been through together. A specific mixture of disappointment, and underneath it, genuine pride that he'd chosen honesty over concealment this time, even when concealment would have been considerably easier. Dr. Reyes helped both of us process that relapse together. In a joint session Connor asked me to attend, explaining that a single lapse, honestly disclosed and immediately addressed, was a meaningfully different pattern than the sustained secrecy that had defined Connor's behavior before that Tuesday night, and that punishing the honesty itself risked teaching Connor the wrong lesson entirely. I understood the logic of that even as it required more patience than my own instincts wanted to offer in the moment, and I've come to appreciate, watching Connor's continued progress in the months since, exactly how right Dr. Reyes was about the distinction mattering. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to be honest, too, about the specific guilt I carried through those weeks, turning over my own role in how disconnected Connor and I had become during his post-divorce years. I told myself at the time that I was respecting his need for space, but sitting with the fuller picture of what he'd actually been going through, I understood how much of that respect had actually been my own discomfort with difficult conversations, a pattern I recognized, uncomfortably, as one I'd absorbed from my own father, a man who'd handled his grief over my mother's passing with a similar, quiet self-containment that had made it difficult for me to fully reach him during his own hardest year. I talked about this specific realization with Dr. Ray's myself. During one of the joint sessions, Connor invited me to attend, and I remember him telling me something that reframed the entire situation for me. That families often pass down not just their strengths but their specific avoidance patterns too, generation to generation, unless someone in the chain makes a deliberate choice to interrupt it. I've thought about that observation often since, understanding that whatever I do going forward to stay more genuinely present in Connor's life isn't just about repairing what happened between the two of us, but about trying to break a pattern that had clearly been passed to me before I ever passed a version of it to him. Warren Boudreaux, in the months since that midnight drive to the emergency room, became something considerably more significant in our family's life than simply the neighbor who'd helped us in a crisis. He started stopping by regularly to check on my father, the two of them developing an easy friendship built partly around Warren's professional medical background, and partly, I think, around a simple mutual enjoyment of each other's company that neither of them had particularly. I want to describe the specific shape that friendship took over the following months, because I think it says something meaningful about what both men had been missing before that Tuesday night brought them into each other's orbit. Warren started coming by most Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, ostensibly to check my father's blood sugar readings and general condition, visits that gradually stretched from 10-minute check-ins into hour-long conversations on my back porch, the two of them trading stories from their working lives, Warren's decades of paramedic calls against my father's 38 years supervising a chemical plant, each man finding in the other a specific kind of listener neither had realized he'd been missing. My father, who'd struggled with a specific, quiet loneliness since my mother's passing that I hadn't fully appreciated until I watched Warren's regular visits noticeably lift his spirits, started referring to Warren within a few months as the son who actually shows up, a comment he made once, half joking, at a family dinner, that landed with a specific, complicated weight given everything that had happened with Connor. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Connor was present at that particular dinner, and I watched his face carefully when my father made that comment, understanding from his expression that the joke had cut considerably deeper than my father had probably intended. Connor didn't say anything defensive in response, which surprised me, given how raw the whole situation still felt for all of us. He simply nodded quietly and told my father later that same evening privately that he understood exactly why the comment had been made, and that he intended to spend however long it took to earn back a version of trust that made comments like that stop feeling accurate. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. I want to describe one specific afternoon, about 8 months after that Tuesday night, that I think crystallizes how much had genuinely changed by then. Connor had driven my father to a routine endocrinology follow-up appointment, a task that had become, by that point, a regular part of their weekly rhythm, and I happened to be home when they returned, watching from my kitchen window as Connor helped my father out of the car with a specific, easy attentiveness that reminded me, with a sudden pang, of exactly the kind of relationship I'd always hoped the two of them would eventually build. They came inside laughing about something from the appointment, my father recounting some joke Connor had apparently made with the nurse, and I remember standing in my own kitchen, watching this considerably lighter version of my son interact with his grandfather, understanding how far both of them had come from the tense, guarded distance that had characterized their relationship for the 2 years following Connor's divorce. Connor told me later that same evening that those weekly car rides had become one of the things he looked forward to most in his schedule, a specific, unhurried time with his grandfather that neither the divorce nor his own shame about the gambling debt had ever managed to fully take away, once he'd finally found the courage to show up for it consistently. My father, for his part, told me separately that he'd noticed, gradually, a specific difference in Connor over those months, a young man who seemed to be carrying himself with considerably less of the guarded heaviness that had defined him since the divorce, replaced by something closer to the easier, more open grandson he remembered from years earlier. I didn't know, sitting at that difficult family dinner, how much Connor's relationship with his grandfather was going to change over the following year, that he was going to start driving my father to his regular endocrinology appointments himself, a task I'd previously handled almost entirely alone, using those car rides as an opportunity to slowly rebuild the closeness that had eroded between them during Connor's difficult post-divorce years. I didn't know that Warren was going to end up teaching Connor, over a series of casual conversations that started almost accidentally, some of the same basic emergency medical assessment skills that had let him respond so effectively that Tuesday night, giving Connor a specific, practical way to make sure he'd never again feel as helpless in a family medical crisis as he'd apparently felt, underneath his panic, calling me back the following morning. I didn't know, either, that the two men Connor had owed the most aggressive portion of his debt to were going to resurface briefly, about 5 months after that initial payoff, attempting to claim Connor owed them an additional, previously undisclosed amount tied to interest they said had been verbally agreed upon, but that Connor had no record of ever confirming. I didn't know that resolving that second, considerably more uncomfortable confrontation was going to require a conversation with a lawyer friend of Patricia's, or how much that second scare was going to reinforce, for both Connor and me, exactly how serious the initial situation had actually been. I didn't know that Warren's own daughter, who lived several states away and who I'd never met, was going to reach out to me directly the following spring, curious about the specific friendship that had developed between her father and mine, wanting to understand more about a man she said had seemed, in phone calls since that Tuesday night, more genuinely content than she'd heard him in years since losing his wife. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, over a year removed from that midnight phone call, is that the worst version of a person's worst moment is rarely the whole truth about who they actually are, however hard that can be to remember in the raw, immediate aftermath of being badly let down by someone you love. I spent that Tuesday night believing my son had simply chosen not to care enough about his own grandfather, and while I don't think that belief was entirely unfair, given the very real consequences of his refusal, I've come to understand, in the year since, that it was also incomplete in a way that mattered enormously for what came after. Connor is doing better now, his debt considerably reduced, down to just under $4,000 from the original 18. His gambling addiction managed with real, sustained effort rather than the desperate secrecy that had once defined it. His relationship with his grandfather rebuilt into something genuinely close rather than merely obligatory. He still sees Dr. Ray's monthly, a habit he's told me he intends to keep up even after the debt is fully repaid, understanding, correctly, that the underlying loneliness that originally drove his gambling requires ongoing attention rather than a single fix. He started dating someone new about 6 months ago, a woman named Sarah he met through a mutual friend, and I've watched him approach that relationship with a specific, deliberate honesty about his own recent struggles that tells me, more clearly than almost anything else, how genuinely he's internalized the lessons of this entire difficult year. He told me, over dinner a few weeks ago, that he disclosed his full financial history to Sarah on their third date, considerably earlier than he might have felt comfortable doing before everything that had happened, explaining to me that he'd rather risk her walking away from an honest picture of who he currently was than repeat the pattern of hiding a struggle from someone who genuinely cared about him. Sarah, as it turned out, hadn't walked away at all, telling Connor that his willingness to be upfront about something so difficult had actually made her trust him more, not less. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Warren remains a fixture in our family's life, the neighbor who answered his phone on the second ring, and in doing so, ended up giving all three of us, my father, my son, and me, considerably more than just a ride to the emergency room that Tuesday night. He still comes by twice a week to check on my father, a routine none of us particularly feel the need to formalize or question, simply an accepted part of how our small, extended family now operates. I think about that Tuesday night often, the specific randomness of which phone calls got answered, and which didn't, understanding, with considerable gratitude, how differently that entire year might have unfolded if Warren hadn't happened to be a light sleeper who kept his phone on the nightstand, or if his particular decades of professional experience hadn't equipped him with exactly the skills my father needed most in that moment. I think, too, about how close I came to letting that Tuesday night simply calcify into a permanent rupture between Connor and me. How easily my own justified anger could have hardened into the kind of lasting resentment that ends up costing a family considerably more than the original crisis ever did. I'm grateful, looking back, that Connor found the courage to come tell me the truth before that anger had a chance to fully set. And I'm grateful, too, that I found enough patience, once I understood the fuller picture, to help him build an actual path forward rather than simply carrying my anger indefinitely. I've thought often, over this past year, about the specific moment that could have gone very differently. If I'd simply stayed angry after that phone call the morning after, if Connor hadn't worked up the courage to drive over that Sunday afternoon, if I'd responded to his eventual confession with more judgment and less willingness to actually help him build a way forward. I don't think any of those alternate versions of the story were inevitable, but I also don't think they were unlikely, given how raw and betrayed I genuinely felt in those first difficult days. What actually happened instead? A family finding its way to something more honest and more connected than what existed before, built out of what could easily have become its most painful rupture, feels, even now, like something I don't fully take for granted. My father, for his part, has told me more than once that he considers that Tuesday night, terrifying as it was in the moment, one of the more meaningful turning points in our extended family's life in years, bringing Warren fully into our orbit and forcing a reckoning with Connor's struggles that might otherwise have continued festering in silence for who knows how much longer. I don't think either of us would have chosen that particular path to arrive at where we are now. But I've stopped needing the story to have unfolded more gently than it actually did. What matters is where all of us ended up together on the other side of it. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. And if you or someone you love is struggling with gambling addiction, please know that support is available and that reaching out for help is a genuine, courageous step. You don't have to carry it alone. Thanks for being here, for real.